It was a quiet summer evening on January 10, 1977. Easey Street, nestled in the inner Melbourne suburb of Collingwood, was like any other working-class neighborhood. Modest homes, friendly neighbors, the hum of daily life, undisturbed by the darkness that had begun to settle over the city. But behind the door of number 147 Easey Street, a horror was unfolding that would send shockwaves through Melbourne. A crime so brutal that its impact would echo for nearly half a century. Inside that humble terrace house lived two young women, Suzanne Armstrong, 27, and Susan Bartlett, 28. They were best friends, sharing the home in search of independence, laughter, and a simple life. Suzanne was a mother, her 16-month-old son Gregory sleeping in the next room, blissfully unaware of the violence that had invaded his home. At some point during the night, the home was breached. Whether by force or by invitation, no one could say. But the events that followed would stain the walls of that house with something far more sinister than time. By morning, the house fell silent. No screams, no struggle, just the unnatural stillness of something terribly, inexplicably wrong. Days passed. It wasn't until January 12, 2 days after the murders, that the alarm was raised. A concerned friend, unable to contact Suzanne or Susan, made their way to the home. The door was unlocked. Hesitantly, they stepped inside, calling out the women's names, but there was no answer. Instead, an eerie quiet swallowed the space. Then, the discovery. Suzanne's body was found first. Stabbed multiple times, her life had been stolen in a frenzy of violence. Just beyond her, Susan lay lifeless, suffering the same brutal fate. Blood stained the walls and floors, evidence of a struggle, of terror, of a final, desperate fight. But in another room, untouched by the carnage, was Gregory. The toddler, just 16 months old, had been alone in that house for 2 whole days. He had survived, hungry, frightened, confused, but alive. A silent witness to a crime he was too young to understand. Melbourne police descended upon Easey Street. The scene was unlike anything they had encountered before. A double homicide, seemingly motiveless, committed with a level of brutality that suggested rage, personal perhaps, but against whom? And why? There was no sign of forced entry, leading investigators to wonder, had the women known their killer? Had they let him in? Or had someone lurked in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike? Neighbors reported hearing nothing. No screams, no struggle. Just the quiet of the night, as if the crime had taken place under a veil of silence. But silence doesn't erase blood. It doesn't erase death. As forensic teams combed through the home, one thing became clear. The killer had left behind no obvious traces, no fingerprints, no weapon, nothing that could immediately point to a suspect. And so began one of Melbourne's most haunting mysteries. 2 young women, brutally murdered, a child left behind, no answers. For the residents of Easey Street, fear settled in like a thick fog. The kind of fear that creeps into your bones, that makes you glance over your shoulder, that makes you wonder if the killer is still out there, watching, waiting. Because in 1977, the police had no idea who had done it, and for decades, neither would anyone else. The investigation began immediately. But from the start, detectives faced a grim reality. There were no clear leads, no immediate suspects, no obvious motive. Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett had no known enemies. They were ordinary young women, living ordinary lives. And yet, someone had entered their home and ended those lives in a brutal, almost frenzied attack. The lack of forced entry troubled investigators. It suggested that the killer had either been let inside willingly or had managed to slip in unnoticed. If Suzanne or Susan had opened the door for their murderer, did they know him? Did they trust him? Or had he convinced them somehow that he wasn't a threat? The brutality of the murders told another story, one of rage, personal or otherwise. Suzanne had been stabbed 29 times. Susan, 55. This wasn't a calculated, precise killing. It was overkill. It was deeply emotional. Someone had wanted them dead. Not just dead, but annihilated. But why? Police canvassed the neighborhood, speaking to residents, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual on the night of January 10. But no one had. No shouts, no cries for help, no sound of a struggle. The killer had moved in silence. Suzanne's son, Gregory, was too young to provide answers. He had been alone with his mother's body for 2 days, a detail that haunted detectives. The killer had spared him. Not out of kindness, but perhaps because he had been deemed unimportant. a witness too young to remember. Forensic evidence in 1977 was limited. DNA profiling did not yet exist. The crime scene was processed, but without the technology to match biological evidence to a suspect, police were left with little more than bloodstains and theories. They worked tirelessly, following every lead, interviewing Suzanne's and Susan's colleagues, friends, and acquaintances. The two women had lived quiet lives. There were no signs of trouble, no recent disputes, no known threats. Over 100 potential suspects were questioned. Some were ruled out quickly. Others were watched closely. But without physical evidence tying any one to the crime, every suspect slipped through their fingers. The weeks turned into months. Leads dried up. The public, horrified at the brutality of the crime, grew restless. Women in Collingwood locked their doors at night, wondering if a murderer still walked among them. As years passed, the case slowly faded from the headlines, buried beneath the weight of time and unanswered questions. Investigators moved on, the city moved on, but the families of Suzanne and Susan never did. And neither did the man who had killed them, because somewhere out there he had gotten away with it. And for nearly 5 decades, he would remain just a shadow, a ghost in the dark, until the past finally caught up with him. Melbourne did not forget. The brutal murders of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett left an invisible wound on the city, one that never quite healed. Year after year, the case remained open but stagnant. Detectives came and went, some returning to the files in search of something missed, some hoping that time might shake loose a new lead. But the years only stretched on, and the silence surrounding Easey Street became deafening. The families of the victims never stopped seeking answers. For Suzanne's son, Gregory, the case was not just a headline or an unsolved mystery. It was the void where his mother should have been. He had no memory of her, no recollection of her voice, her touch, her love. His entire life had been shaped by an event he could never remember. The case became legend, whispered about in true crime circles, analyzed in newspaper retrospectives. It was Melbourne's great unsolved murder, the crime that had no reason, no resolution. But it was not forgotten. The advancements in forensic science in the late 20th and early 21st centuries breathed new life into long-dormant cases. Cold cases were being solved, sometimes decades later, through breakthroughs in DNA analysis. By the early 2000s, the Easey Street case was officially reopened. Investigators turned back to the physical evidence collected in 1977. Back then, it had been little more than bloodstains and fibers, fragments of a story that had no ending. But now forensic science had evolved, and with it, so had the possibility of justice. A DNA profile was extracted from the crime scene. It was a silent fingerprint, a genetic ghost of the man who had walked into that house and left 2 women dead. But even with this profile, there was still one major problem. There was no match. The DNA was entered into Australian databases, then international ones. No hit. No suspect, no name. It was both a breakthrough and a dead end. They now knew the killer had left behind his DNA, but without an identity to match it to, he remained a phantom. Years passed, and again, the case sat in limbo. But the thing about science, about time, is that it never truly stops moving forward. Because in 2024, nearly 5 decades after Suzanne and Susan's murders, something changed. A name emerged. A man long forgotten by investigators. A man who had built a life far from Melbourne, far from Easey Street, far from the shadows of his past. And the past was coming for him. Time had always been the enemy of the Easey Street investigation. Witnesses grew older, memories faded, evidence deteriorated. But in the end, time was also what brought the truth to the surface. The DNA profile extracted from the crime scene in the early 2000s had remained unmatched for years. It was a silent fingerprint, waiting for science to catch up. Then came the revolution of forensic genealogy. Law enforcement agencies worldwide had begun solving cold cases by comparing DNA evidence to samples in public genealogy databases. These databases, originally designed to help people trace their ancestry, had unwittingly become one of the most powerful tools in criminal investigations. In early 2024, Australian detectives, working with international forensic experts, ran the Easey Street DNA profile through an advanced genealogical analysis. The process was complex. Scientists traced family trees, analyzing distant relatives and narrowing down the possibilities. And then, after 47 years, the puzzle pieces clicked into place. A name surfaced, Perry Kouroumblis, a man who in 1977 had been just 17 years old. A former student at the school where Suzanne Bartlett had taught. A name that had never been on any suspect list, never caught in the web of early investigations. But his DNA was there, at the crime scene. There was no mistake. Detectives moved quickly, tracing Kouroumblis's life since 1977. He had left Australia years ago, slipping into anonymity. He had built a life elsewhere, far from the ghosts of Easey Street. But the past was patient, and now it had found him. For decades, Perry Kouroumblis had been a name lost to time. He was never a suspect, never questioned, never even considered. While investigators chased leads that went nowhere, while families mourned with no answers, while a city lived with the haunting knowledge that a killer walked free, he had been living his life. But now, science had caught up. DNA did not forget, it did not lie. When detectives saw the match, they knew this was it. The mystery that had eluded them for nearly half a century had been solved in a single moment, with a single undeniable truth. Perry Kouroumblis was at the scene of the crime. They began piecing together his history. In 1977, he had been a 17-year-old student at the school where Suzanne Bartlett taught, a young man with his whole life ahead of him. But for some reason, one that still remained unclear, he had found himself inside 147 Easey Street that night. Had he been infatuated with Suzanne? Obsessed? Rejected? Or was this something even darker? Random, senseless violence? Committed by a teenager who had hidden his darkness beneath a quiet exterior. Investigators needed to find him. Their search led them far from Melbourne, far from Australia itself. Perry Kouroumblis had left the country years ago. He had lived in multiple places, moving, shifting, never settling too long in one spot. Whether that was intentional or just the path of his life, they couldn't yet say. But by 2024, he was living in Rome, Italy. Unaware that his past was about to come crashing down around him. Rome, a city of ancient history where the past and present intertwine seamlessly. A place where people disappear into the rhythm of daily life, where new identities can be built and old sins can be buried beneath layers of time. But no city, no distance, no passing of years could erase the truth. By the time detectives in Melbourne confirmed the DNA match, Perry Kouroumblis was a 65-year-old man. Nearly 5 decades had passed since the night he stepped into 147 Easey Street. The young man who had once roamed Melbourne's streets had long since faded into obscurity. But now, he was the center of an international manhunt. Working with Italian authorities, Australian investigators tracked Kouroumblis's whereabouts. He had no idea they were coming for him. He had spent 47 years believing he had escaped, that his past would remain buried, that the blood spilled in that small terrace home would never lead back to him. But forensic genealogy had shattered that illusion. Detectives watched, waited, gathered their evidence. This was no longer just an accusation, it was scientific proof. His DNA at the crime scene was irrefutable. The only question that remained was how he would react when confronted with the truth. Would he confess? Deny everything? Claim mistaken identity? Or would he do what he had done for nearly 5 decades? Run. As the pieces of the case came together, Australian authorities coordinated with their Italian counterparts. Legal processes were set in motion. An arrest warrant was prepared. Then, in September 2024, nearly half a century after the murders, the past finally caught up with Perry Kouroumblis. The knock on the door came in the early morning hours. Italian police, working alongside Australian investigators, moved in. There was no dramatic escape, no last-minute attempt to flee. Just an aging man, opening the door to find the weight of his past standing in front of him. For the first time in 47 years, the killer of Suzanne Armstrong and Suzanne Bartlett had a name. And this time, there would be no more running. For 47 years, Perry Kouroumblis had lived as a free man. He had built a life in Rome, far from the ghosts of Melbourne, far from the blood-stained memory of Easey Street. But the past never truly disappears. It waits. And on a quiet September morning in 2024, it knocked on his door. Italian authorities, working in coordination with Australian detectives, surrounded the small apartment where Kouroumblis lived. He had no reason to suspect anything. To him, it was just another morning, the sun rising over the ancient city, the routine of another day. Then came the knock. Firm, unrelenting, a sound that carried the weight of nearly 5 decades of silence. When Perry Kouroumblis opened the door, he was met with the sight of uniformed officers, their presence unmistakable. There was no escape now, no time to fabricate an alibi, no way to argue against the science that had finally uncovered his secret. The officers stepped inside. In fluent Italian, they informed him of the charges. The double murder of Suzanne Armstrong and Suzanne Bartlett, the cold case that had haunted Melbourne for decades. The DNA that had led them straight to him. Kouroumblis did not resist. There was no struggle, no outburst of denial. He listened in silence as his past was read back to him. Had he spent years fearing this moment? Or had he convinced himself he had gotten away with it? That the blood on his hands would never be traced? The arrest was swift. Handcuffs locked around his wrists, the weight of time settling on his shoulders. Outside, the world moved on, oblivious. People walked past, unaware that history was unfolding right beside them, that the answer to one of Australia's most infamous mysteries had just been found in a quiet apartment on the other side of the world. As officers led him away, there was only one question left to answer. Would he finally admit to what he had done? Or would he carry his secrets to the grave? Perry Kouroumblis sat in an interrogation room in Rome, his hands resting on the table before him. The weight of nearly 5 decades pressed down on him, but his face betrayed nothing. No fear, no remorse, just silence. Italian authorities questioned him first. They laid out the charges, the evidence, the DNA match that had shattered the illusion of his innocence. They asked him the only question that mattered. Did you kill Suzanne Armstrong and Suzanne Bartlett? He did not answer. Instead, he sat in silence, his gaze fixed on a point beyond the walls of the room. It was as if he had already resigned himself to his fate. As if, after 47 years, the past had finally caught up, and he no longer had the energy to outrun it. Australian authorities began the process of extradition. This was no simple task. Despite the overwhelming evidence, legal proceedings had to be followed. Papers were filed, courts deliberated. Meanwhile, in Melbourne, the news spread. The city that had long feared the mystery of Easey Street finally had a name, a face, a person to blame. But was that enough? Could a single arrest bring peace to those who had waited decades for justice? For Suzanne Armstrong's son, Gregory, the arrest was more than just a headline. It was the moment he had waited for his entire life. The man who had taken his mother from him had finally been found. But what did that mean now, after all these years? Would it bring closure, or only more questions? Back in Rome, Perry Kouroumblis remained in custody, awaiting his fate. Still, he did not speak. No confession, no denial, no justification. Did he feel regret? Or had he spent so many years burying the truth that he had convinced himself it never happened? The world waited for answers, but Perry Kouroumblis remained silent. After months of legal negotiations, the Italian courts approved Perry Kouroumblis' extradition. He would be sent back to Australia, back to the city he had abandoned, back to the crime he had spent a lifetime escaping. On the day of his transfer, he was escorted through the airport under heavy guard. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Questions rang through the air, questions he had no intention of answering. Mr. Kouroumblis, did you kill Suzanne and Suzanne? Why did you do it? Do you have anything to say to their families? But he remained silent. His face, aged by time but unreadable, gave nothing away. Was he in shock? Or had he made peace with his capture long ago? The man who had evaded justice for 47 years was now shackled, surrounded by law enforcement, boarding a plane bound for Melbourne. As the aircraft took off, a city awaited his return. In Melbourne, the news of his impending arrival sent ripples through the community. People who had long since locked the memory of the Easey Street murders in the past now found themselves revisiting the horror. Families of the victims, former neighbors, retired detectives who had once pored over the case, all of them waiting, wondering if this arrest would finally bring the answers that had eluded them for so long. When the plane landed, he was immediately taken into police custody. The streets of Melbourne had changed since he last walked them, but the shadow of his crime had never truly faded. Inside the police station, he was led to another interrogation room. This time, it was Australian detectives sitting across from him. This time, there was nowhere left to hide. The tape recorder clicked on. A detective leaned forward. "Mr. Kouroumblis, do you have anything to say?" The room held its breath. For the first time in 47 years, the moment of reckoning had arrived. Would he speak? Would he finally confess? Or would he take the truth to his grave? The interrogation room was silent. Perry Kouroumblis sat across from the detectives, his hands resting on the cold steel table. The weight of nearly half a century bore down on him. But his lips remained sealed. The evidence was undeniable. His DNA was at the crime scene. The case that had haunted Melbourne for decades was no longer a mystery. And yet, the most important question of all remained unanswered. Why? Why had a 17-year-old boy walked into 147 Easey Street that night? Why had Suzanne Armstrong and Suzanne Bartlett been targeted? Was it personal, or was it something even darker? Something random, something senseless? The families of the victims needed an answer. The city needed closure. But Kouroumblis refused to speak. As the trial approached, legal experts speculated. Would he finally break in court? Would he plead guilty? Or would he force the victims' families to relive the nightmare all over again in a lengthy trial? No matter what happened next, one thing was certain. The case that had terrified a city, that had left an entire generation wondering if a killer still lurked among them, was finally coming to an end. But was it justice? Or was it just another chapter in a story that would never truly be closed? The truth lay in the hands of one man, and that man refused to speak. If you want more gripping true crime stories and deep dives into the mysteries that time tried to bury, make sure to subscribe. There are always more stories to be told, and more secrets waiting to be uncovered.